At nearly 25 years old, the UFC has been around for quite a long time. Compared to its closest equivalent, the WWE, the UFC has held their cards much closer to their chest. Get it? Because the Fertitta brothers own casinos. Alright, I'll stop. That said, there are some moments from behind the scenes that have trickled down to us fans. Here are 10 infamous behind the scenes moments in the UFC. Don't forget to Superman punch the subscribe button and join the notification squad. Jones and Cormier go off. UFC 214 just wrapped up recently, and it finally appears that the rivalry between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier has been put to bed. Jones is up 2-0 in the feud, and at Cormier's age, it's unlikely we'll see a third fight. But let's not forget one of the high points in this heated war. After an interview with ESPN, both Cormier and Jones were awaiting instruction before Bones opened his mouth and spouted some now legendary words that are too obscene for this video. What followed next was a classic war of words between these two bitter adversaries. Cormier then called Jones fake, he threatened to spit in Jones's face, and Jones retorted by saying he would literally kill him. Now obviously we don't believe that Jones would do that, but the intensity he says it with does make us blink and wonder. Maybe. Well, Cormier dared him to try, and while we never did see a Mortal Kombat match between the two, we do have Jon Jones head-kicking Cormier at UFC 214. So there's that, we suppose. Joe LAUZON versus Nick the Tooth. There's a bunch of guys who for some bizarre reason think they can beat up UFC fighters. You know, essentially trained killers. So no biggie, right? Well, former Dana White friend / crony Nick the Tooth Gulo thought nothing of trying to take on UFC lightweight Joe LAUZON on UFC 155 weekend back in December 2012. For the record, Joe LAUZON is a savage who is tied for the record of most post-fight bonuses in UFC history at 15 and has competed against the who's who of the lightweight division. On Dana White's vlog, Gulo took on LAUZON in a grappling match. The kicker was for every submission that LAUZON got in the 5-minute span, he would get a $1,000 bonus from White. Well, by the end of 5 minutes, LAUZON racked up 6 submissions to Gulo's 0. Who would have seen that coming? What makes this moment even better is Joe Rogan's reaction afterwards. After Gulo tells Rogan that LAUZON was like a tree, Rogan says, yeah, he's a professional effing fighter. Brilliant. Conor McGregor picks a fight. A lot of people love Conor McGregor, and we can totally understand why. The man exudes confidence like our bodies produce carbon dioxide. He says occasionally funny lines and mostly backs up what he says, Nate Diaz aside of course. For as good as Conor is, you just have to wonder what is going through his mind sometimes. Take this incident at UFC 205 for example. This card was headlined by notorious and at the time lightweight champion Eddie Alvarez. In the co-main event was welterweight champion and ridiculously powerful puncher Tyron Woodley. For whatever reason, Conor decided to start mouthing off at Woodley, calling him a woman because he had a camera phone, as well as calling him something rhyming with ditch. So many things wrong with this. 1. Why is calling someone a woman an insult? 2. It's pretty unimaginative for someone who claims to be good at smack talking. 3. Yes, Conor looks real tough saying that while being restrained by security. 4. Tyrone outweighs you by at least 30 pounds, so maybe it's best not to antagonize him. In conclusion, don't push your luck for being a 3-division champion, Mr. McGregor. Maybe defend your belt once in a while too, huh? Bas Rutten is a madman. For those who don't know, the Joe Rogan Experience podcast is a treasure trove of insane stories whenever Rogan has somebody from the fighting world on. He's had big names like George St. Pierre on, and even lesser known ones like Ensign Inoue. The most consistently entertaining guest would have to be El Guapo, Bas Rutten. Rutten has stories about getting into bar fights in Sweden and fighting ninjas who came to his school. Seriously. The one we're going to focus on today involves Bas Rutten and a giant needle. At some point in his career, Bas Rutten received a massive neck injury from a wrestler who slammed him from a triangle choke. Did a silly neck injury stop Rutten from fighting? Hell no. Instead of taking time off, Rutten would instead take a giant needle of lidocaine and poke it through his ribs as a painkiller. One time when he did this, a UFC camera crew was filming backstage, and once they saw Rutten with a needle, they pulled away like they walked in on a mob hit. Geez guys, haven't you seen a giant Dutchman poking himself with a needle before? Hospital fight. Most of the time when a UFC fight is over, fighters will let bygones be bygones. Even heated rivals like Gray Maynard and Frankie Edgar or Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos are able to shake hands and go their own ways. But most fighters aren't Nick Diaz, a man who lost all the cares he had to give back when the dinosaurs died. Diaz could have his mouth sewn shut, but somehow he would still mouth off to the sewer. At UFC 57, Diaz took on veteran of the sport and one-time UFC #1 contender Joe Riggs. Riggs won the match by close decision, but the fight was far from finished. At the hospital they were taken to, post-fight, Riggs was walking by Diaz's room where insults started to fly. As soon as Riggs turned his back, Diaz came up and socked him in the mouth, knocking out part of his tooth. For the next 5 minutes, the two fighters would grapple, brawl, and whenever it struck their fancy, trash talk to each other. Metal trays, IV bags, nothing was spared in this assault. The two were eventually separated, but we can't think of a more insane brawl than this. Hey there, whoa, calm down. We're not here to fight, we're just here to ask a trivia question. What was the name of the man who was seen as the babysitter to the stars that left the company in 2015? Stay tuned for the answer. What's her name again? When the UFC was purchased by WME ING in 2016, a lot of questions were posed by fans and media alike about how the UFC was going to go. We're not going to get into the whole Reebok sponsorship debacle, but another matter entirely. Those fears were quickly realized when the UFC seemed to only be focusing on promoting two fighters, Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor. Well, funny thing about putting all your eggs in two baskets, it could easily go very wrong. Everyone knows that in MMA, and sports in general, that nothing is for certain. Apparently some folks of the UFC's new management slept through that sports history class. On UFC commentator Joe Rogan's Fight Companion podcast, he told a story at UFC 207 where an executive didn't even know Ronda Rousey's opponent's name. He described her as cannon fodder for Rousey. The opponent? Current UFC bantamweight champion Amanda Nunes. As if to leave a mental first imprint of who she was on the executive's brain, Nunes pummeled Rousey into obscurity by TKOing her in 48 seconds into the first round. Whoops. Nameless UFC executive, maybe next time, look at the second half of your main event. Kevin Randleman loses backstage. Brain trauma is obviously a huge problem in combat sports. It turns out that getting hit in the head multiple times for a living isn't conducive to mental health. Who would have thunk it, eh? Normally though, fighters only have to worry about that once they step foot into the octagon. This wasn't the case with Kevin Randleman. This former UFC heavyweight champion was a relentless wrestler and an incredible power puncher, famously KOing Mirko Cro Cop in Pride FC. His greatest opponent though might not be a human being, but the very floor itself. Yes, believe it or not, something as common as a slip caused the main event of UFC 24 to be cancelled. As he was warming up for his title defense versus Pedro the Rock, no, not that one, Rizzo, he stepped on a pipe, slipped like a Looney Tunes cartoon and knocked himself out. The fight was postponed until UFC 26. Fans would have been upset, but to be honest, the UFC would have loved to have any fans at that dark time in company history. Dana White lies about GSP. We're gonna drop a knowledge bomb on you that you might not be able to handle. You bracing for impact? Alright, we warned you. Dana White lies. I know that sounds insane, but you have to believe us. If you don't trust us, trust GSP. Come on, he's Canadian. Would he lie? After his fight with Johnny Hendricks at UFC 167, Rush was plenty banged up. He had just won the toughest title defense of his career, but he was still able to attend the press conference. However, a UFC employee backstage told him that he wasn't allowed to go. White was claiming that GSP had to be sent to the hospital and proceeded to rag on him for hinting at retirement, saying he owed everyone a rematch with Hendricks. Knowing that some BS was afoot, GSP pushed aside the people stopping him from going to the presser, and White tried to save face, but we now know the truth. GSP attributed this incident as part of the reason why he took his leave from the UFC, as he thought Dana White should have handled this with more class. Well, St. Pierre, we regret to inform you that all the class White has is low class. Ariel Helwani, banned. Imagine, if you will, if the NFL were to ban Adam Schefter for being too negative in his coverage of the league. How about Bob McKenzie from the NHL, or if any other league banned one of the best reporters in the game for being, throwing those loose air quotes again, too negative? Well, that's exactly what happened to MMAfighting.com's Ariel Helwani, the premier journalist of the MMA world. At UFC 199, Michael Bisping realized his career goal by finally winning the UFC middleweight title after being in the promotion for over 10 years. Unfortunately, Helwani didn't get to see it, as he was thrown out of the building along with his colleagues, Esther Lin and Eugene Leyden. The reason for this ban was simply for doing his job. He scooped the UFC on the news of Brock Lesnar fighting at UFC 200. Since Dana White has the emotional maturity of a 5-year-old, he lashed out and took away Helwani's press credentials and briefly banned him for life. The ban didn't last long because of the horrendous press the UFC got, but the fact that it happened at all is insanity. Nate Diaz takes on a mountain. Alright, so it's not quite Conor McGregor taking on the actual mountain from Game of Thrones in a playful sparring match, but this actually may be better. At the same event where Helwani got banned for doing his job, Nick Diaz's little brother, Nate Diaz, was being, well, a Diaz brother and got into a fight backstage. Just another Saturday night for Nate, really. The person he picked to fight is a little insane, that man being Jason Guida. Guida is the older brother of UFC lightweight Clay Guida and is a former fighter himself. Now, while he doesn't nearly have the gravitas of Nate Diaz, the fact is that he's a trained MMA fighter who has competed in several MMA matches while weighing at least 40 pounds more than Nate. Once Clay insulted Nate though, Nate didn't give a damn and got into it with his brother. UFC officials swarmed the scene and broke it up before it got out of hand, but man, that night in Inglewood, California was pretty crazy. Glad to see you made it. The name you were looking for as the babysitter to the stars is Burt Watson. Watson was a beloved behind-the-scenes presence at the UFC who was always on hand to make sure fighters knew where they had to be and when to go. That's it for our list. Are there any crazy or hilarious moments that we missed? Let us know in the comments section below. The UFC might not have the same wealth of behind-the-scenes shenanigans as the WWE, but we're sure that we could have missed a couple. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to TheSportster for more awesome content. Thanks for watching.